Okay, Henry, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Alright, so my IOP is going to be on the historical notes in The Handmaid's Tale. So I'd like to begin with a question. Who here read the historical notes? Alright, so like a total of 4 people. So my next question is, who thought the book ended without a resolution? Alright, a lot of people. Can one of the people who just raised their hand tell me why they thought the book ended without a resolution?
I can tell you personally for me, like, you know, the way that she built it up, like, okay, yeah, she just did this, that, and the third. And then the way it ended, it was just like so simple, like a really bad cut.
Like a cliffhanger, right? So my thesis is that Atwood uses a change in narrator, parentheticals, and historical parallels to trivialize the experience of Offred, as well as critique the way our society studies and understands history. So the narrator changes from Offred's first-person point of view into that of a professor giving a keynote speech at a conference on Giladian studies. So this is significant because the change means that Offred is no longer in control of her own narrative. And she's now the topic of conversation of the academic world. The other significance is that her narrative is now in the hands of a man. The professor is a man, and this is ironic because men served as the primary oppressor of the handmaids and the oppressor of Offred, who was a handmaid, in the time of Gilead. And through this shift, Atwood is commenting on academia's failure to accurately capture history because of the role of oppressors and the role of privileged people being so central in the writing and the retelling of history. So my first quote is an example of a parenthetical used in the text. So if you didn't already know, parenthetical is this right here. It's in the and it denotes, you know, laughter or some other sound that the audience would make. So the Underground Female Road, since dubbed by some of our historical wags the Underground Frill Road, laughter, groans. So the speaker is professor of Giladian studies, and he's joking about the resistance that tried to get women out of the oppressive clutches of Gilead. In doing so, he trivializes the rape, struggle, and oppression faced by Offred and the other handmaids. And the parenthetical here, it shows that the audience is laughing at the joke despite its patriarchal and trivializing tone. So it shows a group mentality that this was something that was funny to them, despite how not funny and how real it was for the handmaids. So by using that parenthetical to show the group's mentality, Atwood aptly critiques the way we look at history and how privileged groups constantly trivialize the struggles of marginalized groups. This theme is very central to the novel, as well as our own studies, because when approaching a marginalized group's history, it can be easy to approach it as a joke because it is very easy to take for granted one's own privilege. Atwood seeks to call out this behavior through the use of the parenthetical, and she's calling out the point of view that we approach history from. So my next quote. Also, Giladian society was under a good deal of pressure, demographic and otherwise, and was subject to factors from which we ourselves are happily more free. Our job is not to censure, but to understand. Applause. So, this has a lot of stuff in it, a lot of content. This comes later in the speech, and anyone who's read The Handmaid's Tale knows that Gilead was an oppressive and somewhat evil society. From like the routine rape to the cruel executions, Gilead appears like a crisis needing international intervention, right? Who would have wanted someone to intervene in Gilead? Alright, a lot of hands. However, the speaker's self-described editorial, he seems to make an excuse for Gilead, as well as call for an approach of Giladian history through cultural relativism. The applause from the audience is noted in the parenthetical, and the overall group who are supposed to be scholars in the field of Giladian studies, they have little qualms about the objectification and the oppression of women in Gilead, nor do they have qualms about the security state created by the sons of Jacob. Instead, they choose to take a let's not judge approach when focusing on Gilead and the people who were oppressing the handmaids and the women in Gilead. And therefore, they're making excuses for the oppressors, for the sons of Jacob, who created this cruel society. So through this, Atwood makes a critique of historians and anthropologists. And she's saying that when you approach an oppressive society, or a society that hurts others, you shouldn't approach it through cultural relativism, because things like this can happen. You're making excuses for a group that is oppressing people, and Atwood is pointing out that that's not necessarily right. Alright, so in my last quote concerning parentheticals, she appears to have been an educated woman, insofar as a graduate of any North American college of the time may be said to have been educated. Laughter, some groans. So in this quote, the speaker differentiates Offred from the audience by insinuating that Offred was less educated, using a joke about American education. So this tactic of differentiating oneself from an oppressed group is common, right? It's often used to create a disconnect and remove empathy between a marginalized group and a privileged one. For example, when white scientists and other powerful white people spread misinformation that black people were subhuman in order to justify their oppression of black people. So this isolates the audience from Offred to objectify her as a dot on the timeline of history instead of a human being. So that removes the empathy surrounding that. So Atwood uses the laughter in the parenthetical to show that the separation is done through a joke and to critique the way historians trivialize oppressed people's experiences. And also how they divide groups and joke about serious matters such as the oppression of women in Gilead. So she's critiquing the fact that men and other oppressors joke about the struggles and the stories of marginalized people in the way they joke about Offred. So this is very problematic because it removes the human experience and empathy from history, which whitewashes injustice and oppression. So I'm going to talk about some historical parallels next. So there were a lot of historical parallels throughout the book, and especially in the last chapter, which was the historical notes. So from one we have the Underground Female Road, which many of you probably guessed is a parallel to the Underground Railroad. They followed similar paths, and the way, And then there's Save the Women, which is a parallel to Save the Children, which is a nonprofit that, helps further education and children's rights around the world. There are the Red Uniforms, and the Red Uniforms are, I believe, from Canadian prisoner of war camps that housed Nazi soldiers during World War II. And then there's the Jewish repatriation scheme, which I think might be the most interesting of all of the historical parallels. And in the Jewish repatriation scheme, in the novel, it states that a lot of the Jews left. And actually, what was happening was they privatized the way that they sent the Jews out of Gilead so that the sons of Jacob could make money. And a lot of times, they would dump the boats and essentially drowning and killing all the passengers were exclusively Jewish, instead of making the whole trip. That way it could save them money. This very much parallels the Holocaust, where Jewish people were also targeted in a genocide. And it also parallels the way that our society now uses the prison industrial complex and privatizes off of social problems. And the privatization of these things leads to the death and violence against these said oppressed groups. So the political theorist Edmund Burke once said, "Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it." So Atwood uses these many historical parallels to both validate and contradict this quote. Despite that it's a historical conference, it models the many behaviors that enable history to repeat. The trivializing, the patriarchal and joking manner of the keynote speaker shows that they're not taking this seriously and are doomed to repeat it. By writing the historical notes as such, Atwood contradicts the aforementioned quote. Instead, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Despite knowing a lot about Gilead, the lack of gravity that Gilead holds with the people who attend the conference shows that they have not learned from Gileadian history. So Atwood uses this to critique the structure of academia and the way history is taught and discussed, creating a foreboding feeling that Gilead is doomed to be repeated. So in conclusion, the masterful shift in the historical notes chapter reveals the meaning of The Handmaid's Tale, showing that there is more to the novel than Atwood's critique of society and misogyny, but there's also Atwood's critique of history and how we view history. With the final critique, Atwood closes the novel in order to provide the story with somewhat of a proper ending, really driving through her message in that last chapter. All right, thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Henry?
Julian?
Is there like remaining supporters say that?
Can you say that again, but louder?
People in the crowd at the event.
Through the use of parentheticals, I think that Atwood definitely intends to characterize some of these historians as Gileadian sympathizers. Yes.
So I have a question
Yes.
as well. So when you say, and I really like this idea. I really enjoyed this IOP. I thought a lot of your ideas were super great. Talk to me a little bit about when you say sort of like how we view history. So when you say we, who's the we that you're talking about?
So when I say we, I'm approaching it from, I would describe it as like an American viewpoint of history and how we view history in a classroom setting. And I think that a lot of times we fail to, like as a society, we fail to see history from a point of view that really values or accurately describes and values the history and the point of view of marginalized people, and instead predominantly values the oppressors and their historical writings throughout the course of history.
Great.
Anyone else?
Good question.
Thanks.
Okay, great job, Henry. 11 minutes and 30 seconds. Okay.